That afternoon at the park started like any other. It was one of those days when you just want to leave the house and get some fresh air. I decided to take my son to the park. He was excited as usual. Kids, right? Any chance to play is a party. We got there, and he immediately ran to the playground while I sat on a bench with my book in hand, trying to enjoy a moment of peace. I could see him from where I was, climbing onto the swing. Everything seemed normal, nothing out of the ordinary. After a while, I started noticing something strange. He was on the swing, swinging alone, but talking. At first it was fine, kids sometimes make up stories while playing. But I don't know, something about the way he was talking seemed more real. He was gesturing as if he were having a real conversation with someone. I looked around, thinking maybe another kid had come over, but no, he was alone. That started to make me uncomfortable, but I still tried to ignore it. Kid stuff, I thought. What happened next is what really started to bother me. Out of nowhere, he got off the swing and began walking away from the park. But he wasn't just walking. It was like he was holding someone's hand, you know? That thing kids do when they walk hand in hand. But there was no one there. I stood up suddenly and called his name, with that voice that mixes worry and anger. He stopped and looked at me as if nothing was wrong. He walked back slowly, like he'd snapped out of a trance. When he got close, I asked, "Where were you going?" And his answer is what sent a chill down my spine. "I was going with Anne." In that moment, I thought, who the hell is Anne? So I said, "But you were alone, son. There was no one with you." He insisted calmly, "Yes, there was, Dad. Anne was with me." I was disturbed. I didn't know what to say. I stood there, trying to process it. After a few seconds, all I could say was, "Let's go home. Enough park for today." And he, not understanding why I was acting so weird, just agreed, and we left. The rest of the day was normal, but that Anne story wouldn't leave my mind. After that day at the park, I couldn't stop thinking about Anne. You know when something keeps nagging at you, and you try to move on, but it's like something always pulls you back? That's how it was for me. I didn't bring it up again with my son that day, I just let it go. I thought it was just his imagination, maybe an imaginary friend or something. But still, it bothered me, especially the way he talked about her, like she was someone real. Night came and we followed our normal routine. We had dinner, he watched a little TV, and then I went to put him to bed. He seemed calm, which eased me a bit. Maybe I'm overreacting, I thought. I went to bed with my wife and told her what had happened at the park. She also found it strange, but ended up laughing, saying it was normal, just kid stuff. She tried to convince me I was freaking out over nothing. But then, in the middle of the night, things started getting really weird. My wife and I were just about to fall asleep when we heard a noise coming from our son's room. It sounded like he was talking to someone. At first, I thought he had woken up and was playing by himself, so I tried to ignore it. But after a while, the noise didn't stop. My wife looked at me with that face that said, "Go see what's going on." I got up and went to his room, walking slowly so I wouldn't startle him. When I got near the door, I could hear it clearly. He was talking, like he was having a normal conversation with someone. It wasn't that kind of make-believe play kids do with their toys. It was a real conversation, like there was another person in the room. I stood by the door for a second, trying to understand what was happening. Then I knocked on the door and asked, "Who are you talking to, son?" He answered calmly, "With Anne, Dad." In that moment, my heart skipped a beat. I quickly opened the door, expecting, I don't know, something. But of course, he was alone in the room, sitting on the bed. I looked around, checked the closet, the floor. Nothing. No one. Just him, sitting there, looking at me like I was the crazy one. My wife showed up right behind me, and when she heard him mention Anne again, she went pale. We tried to explain to him that no one was there, that it was just in his head, but he insisted. She was just here. Anne was playing with me. By that point, we were speechless. We went back to bed, but we couldn't sleep properly after that. The feeling that something very wrong was happening took over the house. The next day, I decided to investigate. You know, I went looking for anything that could explain what was happening. I started searching for old news about the park, local stories, anything. After a few hours, I found an old newspaper from 1985, and there it was. The headline that made me freeze. A little girl named Anne had died in that park many years ago. It was a terrible accident. In that moment, everything made sense. Anne wasn't an imaginary friend. My son was seeing something, or someone. After learning about Anne from the newspaper, my wife and I became even more worried. This wasn't a coincidence. We didn't know what to do. We just knew our son was somehow connected to this girl. And let me tell you, I can't describe the fear I felt at that moment. I've always been a skeptic, never believed in this sort of thing, but right there, with all the pieces coming together, there was no way to ignore it. The next day, we called a priest. It was the only thing that came to mind, you know? Maybe it was something spiritual, who knows? The priest came to our house, blessed my son's room, prayed for him, and we did what he told us to do. We placed a cross above his bed and prayed with him every night. After that, he never mentioned Anne again. It seemed like everything had gone back to normal. But I never forgot. To this day, I still wonder if it was real, if my son really saw that girl. And every now and then, in the silence of the night, I ask myself, did she really leave? It was a normal morning, just like so many others. My mom always woke up early, made coffee, and we would sit together before I went to school. I was anxious. There was an important exam, one of those that decide whether you pass or not. I woke up, got ready, and was sitting at the table, ready to leave. But suddenly, my mom showed up looking different. She seemed strange, with a look on her face I had never seen before. She sat in front of me, looked at me in a way that would make anyone uncomfortable, and said, "Today you're not going to school." I laughed, thinking she was joking. "What do you mean, Mom? I have a test." But she was serious. She shook her head and said she had a bad dream. I didn't understand. My mom was never the type to care about dreams, you know? I don't ever remember her making a fuss because of a dream before. Of course, I insisted. I needed to go because of the test. I didn't want to miss it. But she was firm. She said she'd talk to the teacher the next day, that she'd explain everything, and that today I couldn't leave the house for any reason. The way she spoke worried me, like she knew something I didn't. So I asked her what the dream was, what had scared her so much. But all she said was, "Better not to talk about it. I just know it was bad. Really bad." That answer gave me a strange feeling. It wasn't just the dream, it was how she was acting. You know when you feel like something's wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on it? That's how it was. But in the end, my mom insisted so much that I ended up staying home. It didn't make sense, but the way she was acting left me with no choice. I spent the whole morning not knowing what to do. I tried watching TV, but nothing held my attention. The house's silence was weird, heavy, like something was about to happen. My mom was nervous too. She walked around the house differently, like she was expecting bad news any minute. And then, around 1 in the afternoon, the radio, which she always kept on, brought the worst news we could imagine. It was at that moment the radio started crackling and announced, "Mass shooting at the local school, 10 students shot, 5 dead and 5 critically injured." The fight started as a gang confrontation in front of the school. Man, I froze. I knew right away it was my school. We lived in a small town and there wasn't another school nearby. My heart stopped and I could only think, if I had gone, I'd probably be right there in the middle of it. To make it worse, shortly after, they listed the names of the injured, and among them was my best friend. What would I have done if I'd been there? We always walked together, met at the gate. I couldn't stop thinking that maybe I'd be there, right next to him, and that one of those bullets could have been for me. My mom was standing in the kitchen, frozen, listening to it all. She didn't say anything, but I could see the relief mixed with fear on her face. She knew she had done the right thing, but at the same time you could tell she was thinking about the other moms, the other kids. We stayed silent for a long time, neither of us knowing what to say. What do you even say at a time like that? I tried calling my friend, but no one answered. And even if they did, what would I say? "Hey man, how are you? I heard you got shot." It didn't make sense. My head was spinning, and all I could think was I should have been there with him. But at the same time, I was relieved that I wasn't. It was a confusing mix of feelings that I couldn't sort out. After that afternoon, the mood in my house changed. My mom got even weirder, quieter, like she knew something I hadn't realized yet. At night, we tried to have dinner, but we could barely eat. No one brought it up, but it was in the air, you know? That feeling that something big had just happened and we didn't know how to deal with it. I went up to my room earlier than usual, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the scene. I imagined what it must have been like there. People running, the screams, the panic. And worst of all, my friend in the middle of it, and I couldn't do anything to help him. I felt powerless, and it made me feel awful. My mom passed by the hallway 2 or 3 times, like she wanted to say something but gave up before knocking on the door. She couldn't sleep either, you could tell. The worst part is, even knowing I was safe, the feeling that something was still wrong wouldn't leave me. It was like the nightmare wasn't over yet, like something was still hanging in the air, waiting to happen. I couldn't shake it off, and to be honest, even today I still feel it sometimes. It's hard to explain, but it's like somehow that day never really ended. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was my first year as a teacher at El Paso High School in Texas. I had already heard some rumors about the school being haunted, but honestly, I never gave it much thought. I always thought those ghost stories were exaggerated, especially in such an old school like that, built around the 1910s. You know how it is. Old buildings always have their stories. They creak, make strange noises. But what I experienced there, it's not so easy to explain. In the first few days, some of my colleagues mentioned, half-jokingly, about certain things that happened in that school. People talked about doors closing by themselves, voices in empty hallways, that kind of stuff. I even laughed at those stories, thinking it was just to scare the newcomers like me. But El Paso High is full of stories, not just because it's one of the oldest schools in the state, but also because of how many people have passed through there. It seems like the building holds a strange energy, as if time has stopped in some corners. Well, it didn't take long for me to start realizing that maybe those stories weren't just hallway gossip. The first incident that happened to me was one afternoon right after lunch. I was in the teacher's lounge, relaxing a bit before the next class. You know when you're in your own world, reviewing some tests, kind of lost in your thoughts? That's how it was. Suddenly, I felt something touch my leg, like someone had poked me from under the table. At the moment, I thought it was one of my colleagues, but when I looked, there was no one. The room was practically empty. There was just one other teacher there, and he was on the other side of the room, too far to be the one. I felt a little unsettled, but I didn't want to think much about it, you know? It had been a long day, I was tired. Maybe that was all. But things started getting weirder. A few days later, I went to the bathroom on the 3rd floor, a floor we barely used because it was always kind of abandoned. After washing my hands, I went to leave and the bathroom door wouldn't open. At first, I thought it was locked from the inside, but I hadn't locked anything. I insisted, forced the handle, and nothing. At that moment, I started feeling a strange chill run through my entire body. At that point, I thought it was necessary to call the janitor, but luckily, the school's security guard showed up. I called him over and told him the door was stuck. When he approached the door and grabbed the handle, it simply opened, like it had never been locked. He looked at me with a face that said, "You're kidding, right?" He gave me a look like he thought I was crazy. He said the door was fine, that I probably just hadn't turned the handle right. But at that moment, I knew something wasn't right. After that day, I started noticing more strange things. The cleaning staff talked about noises at night, the sound of children running through the empty hallways. And then came the night that really got to me. I was grading papers late, it was around 9 at night, and the school was practically deserted. Everything was quiet. Suddenly, I started hearing a distant, muffled sound. It sounded like a baby crying. At first, I thought it was just in my head. After all, who would bring a baby to a school at that hour? But the crying got louder, closer, until it seemed to be coming from right outside the teacher's lounge. I tried to ignore it, thinking it must be just fatigue. But man, it's hard to ignore when that cry seems to be coming straight toward you. I stood up and went to check the hallway. And this is where things get bizarre. At the end of the hallway, I saw a woman. She was wearing an old uniform, like from the time when the school first opened. She was holding something in her arms, and the image was kind of blurry, as if I couldn't quite focus on her. But one thing was clear. She was holding a baby. After that night, things started to escalate in a way I hadn't expected. I saw that woman at the end of the hallway holding the baby, with that distorted image, like I was looking through a dirty window. My first reaction was to freeze. It wasn't ordinary fear, you know. It was that kind of paralysis that locks you in place and makes you doubt your own eyes. I still tried to convince myself that it was just fatigue. Maybe I was just imagining things. After all, I had stayed late at school grading papers, and the lighting in that part of the hallway was pretty poor. But the baby's cry, that was real. So real that even now, when I think about it, I can almost hear it again. I decided to follow the woman, but as soon as I took a step toward her, she suddenly disappeared. Just like that, gone. There was no door in that part of the hallway, no way out. And then I froze completely. When I turned around to head back to the room, I saw the security guard coming from the direction she had vanished. I asked him if he had seen a woman holding a baby. He laughed, thinking it was a joke. "A woman? Here at this hour? You're seeing things, Professor." He said it with that tone of disbelief, but deep down, I knew he found it odd. After all, the building was practically empty. Who would be there with a baby in the middle of the night? That episode shook me, but I tried to move on. In the following days, nothing happened. I kept teaching, grading papers, trying to forget what I had seen. I told the security guard again what had happened, and he just laughed. But I knew he had heard the same stories I had. The school was famous for its strange events, and many people claimed to have seen similar things. But no one talked about it seriously, you know? It was always a joke, something to pass the time, but I knew it wasn't my imagination. It couldn't be. Weeks went by, and I started feeling something strange within myself. I don't know if it was paranoia or if the school was really getting to me. I found myself staring at the corners of rooms, expecting to see some movement, a shadow that shouldn't be there. Sometimes I heard strange noises like soft footsteps in the hallway, even when I knew I was alone. The last straw came on another night, about 2 weeks after that first incident. Again, I was grading papers after hours. The school was deserted as usual, and all I could hear was the sound of paper being turned. But then, out of nowhere, the crying started again. This time, it wasn't so distant. It was clear, distinct, as if the baby was right outside the teacher's lounge door. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was just in my head. But the crying kept getting louder, and I knew I wasn't imagining it. I grabbed my coat and decided to leave right then and there. I didn't have the nerve to investigate again, but when I got to the door, it wouldn't open. I tried turning the handle 3-4 times, but nothing. It was as if it was locked. I knew that door didn't have a lock, it never needed one. I started sweating because none of it made sense, and then suddenly the handle turned on its own and the door opened slowly with that eerie creak. On the other side, the hallway was empty, but the crying, it still echoed. And then I saw her again, the woman, at the end of the hallway holding the baby in her arms. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream, but it was like my feet were glued to the ground. She stood there, staring in my direction. And before I could react, she disappeared again, just like the last time. The next morning, I walked into the classroom knowing I couldn't take it anymore. After class, I called a colleague and told him everything, every detail. He laughed, of course. Who wouldn't? Ghost stories, Professor? Come on, this is just an old building. But I could see in his eyes that the doubt had been planted. He had heard the same stories but chose to pretend he didn't believe. That's when I knew I couldn't stay any longer. Those nights at the school, the noises that only I seemed to hear, it was getting to my head. I decided it was best to resign before I lost my sanity completely. I never looked into that woman nor the baby. I didn't want to investigate the school's past, and I preferred to leave things as they were. I left without much explanation, but even today, whenever I pass by El Paso High School, I get chills.